Morning glory and evening grace, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt on this October 7th, the second anniversary of the massacre. I don't think any of us who saw it will ever forget. We're very blessed today to have Haviv Rettig Gur join us, I believe, from Israel. Haviv should be familiar to many of you, but Haviv, I've got to let you know, we add affiliates every day, including today. We're welcoming WHEE in Martinsville, Virginia, AM 1370. So they won't know Haviv unless they've seen you on the Free Press or they've seen you on other media outlets. Can you give them just a brief capsule of who you are and what you do in Israel?
Sure. Born in Jerusalem, lived most of my life in Jerusalem, but a good 40% of my childhood, I think, was in the States because of my parents' work. So that's where the English is from. And I'm a journalist for about 20 years now. And that's basically the story. My work is basically translating what Israelis think and feel, what the Israeli experience is, because I have a native-born Hebrew, into English-speaking discussions and debates about what's going on. I don't have all the answers, but at least to make the debate a little bit richer and deeper. That's kind of
Since
my
the
work and my goal.
invasion of Israel by Hamas and other terrorists on 10/7, you've devoted a lot of time to coming to the United States and talking to college campuses and Jewish groups and non-Jewish groups alike. You were here recently, I think. Am I right about that?
Yeah, last month.
Okay, so you've been able to watch America over these 2 years as well as Israel. I want to begin by asking you this. Next September, America will celebrate or commemorate the 25th anniversary of the attack on America on 9/11. We've forgotten a lot of the lessons of 25 years ago, and I know because I've been on the air 5 days a week for 25 years talking about this. Do you think Israel's going to forget 10/7 or the lessons of 10/7 in another 23 years?
No, I don't think Israel's going to forget it. Israel isn't America. It's not the size of a continent. It's not 350 million people. It's small. If Israel didn't have the competence it has, look, Israel's the only country with a competent, seriously powerful economy, right? I think our GDP passed Britain's, our GDP per capita. That doesn't have oil in the region. We're the only country that has a just serious, competent democracy with feedback loops and checks and self-criticism and a free press in the region. And if we lose those abilities, those strengths, that ability to have a military that actually knows what it's doing, many of the Arab militaries are big and fancy and expensive, but can't fight because they are, in fact, just sort of hollowed out shells with oil money spent to buy Western weapons, but not serious training. They don't actually go to war. So we're a country that has a lot of very, very good strengths, but is tiny and has enemies who built out their entire ideological world on our destruction. There's so many parts to this Muslim Brotherhood network in the region, the Shia revolutionary ideology of Iran, that just think that as long as Israel exists, Islam will be down. The Jews are keeping the Muslim world down. All these kinds of ideologies that are genocidal ideologies that want to destroy us, and we have to stay strong and serious and competent, and they'd never let us forget it. So October 7 is what they would do to us if they could, and they must never be able to. That is, I think, the one thing all Israelis agree on.
Well, I used to think, and I think I said many times because I was broadcasting on 9/11, this is changing our country forever. We will never forget. And in fact, in the elections of 2002, less than a year and 2 months later, serious people triumphed in majorities in the Congress. George W. Bush triumphed again in 2004. But by 2006, we were war weary. By 2008, it had worn off. There was also a financial crisis. President Obama won. President Obama pulled out of Iraq in 2011. We got ISIS. By 2020, we had total amnesia, and President Biden was elected, and he just pulled everyone out of Afghanistan and didn't think anything bad would happen. I don't know what happens if you take another holiday from history. We took a holiday from history, and we got whacked, and we brought ISIS on the world, and we may have led to 10/7. Certainly, President Trump makes that argument. Is there any chance at all that your people will forget what happened on 10/7?
No. The simple answer is no. But let me make a case for forgetfulness. Countries that are run by dictators and by ideologues with vast, world-conquering ideologies that they're willing to sacrifice their own people for, are countries that never forget. Never, they live in a myth. They force everyone to constantly be marching in lockstep. They oppress. They force everyone to have the same opinion. When you have a country that sees itself, its fundamental purpose, as the freedom of its own people, then ordinary people and the needs of ordinary people, the day-to-day, the simple, the local, triumphs always. Politics is always local is a famous phrase of American politics. But that's only true in America. That's not true in North Korea. In North Korea, all politics is whatever the leader wants it to be. And so you will always forget the traumas because you will always suddenly prioritize tomorrow morning sending all the kids to school and making sure that your economy's running right and all of that stuff. You will forget. And you know what? This happened to us in 1973, where we thought we were riding high and everything was fine and we had an economy to look after, and the enemy surprised us. And 50 years later, it happened in 2023. And we thought everything was fine and the enemy was deterred, and our basic job was to go into high tech and build fancy things. And the enemy surprised us. And we will be very strong and very vigilant. And then in a generation, maybe we will forget again, because the fundamental purpose of the Israeli state and the Israeli people is a good life for ordinary people. And so democracies will always forget, and the enemy will always come for them, and they will always discover their strength, and they will always rise up and show what only democracies are capable of. I don't know how to get away from it, but I also think that I'd rather be on my side of that than on the side that's constantly remembering, because that's
I would
ideology.
also much rather be on our side, our shared side. I tell people in the audience every day, Israel is our greatest ally. They are the only superpower with whom we are allied that has the will and the intelligence to project power when necessary, and they have an arsenal that is at least second to none other than the United States and the People's Republic of China and Russia, and they've got very tough people running it. And as a result, they're our best ally. But I'm wondering about, for example, one thing I didn't foresee. You write for the Free Press. Today, Michael Duran is a very smart guy, has an article in the Free Press. The Jews, in quotes, are a proxy for a far bigger political fight. I did not anticipate the United States having an explosion of anti-Semitism after the state of Israel was savaged on 10/7. Did you? Did anyone that you know see that coming?
No. No, I think that shocked us completely. And the form it took, not criticism of Israel, but the idea that the Jews of Israel are the last living Jews in the Eastern Hemisphere. The 20th century was the emptying of 3 continents of Jews. Every last Jew left Baghdad. Baghdad was twice as Jewish in percentage as New York City in 1930, and is empty, totally empty of Jews. And then to come and say, "Oh, you Israelis, you last living Jews in the hemisphere, you should not exist." The form that it took, the obsession. When this obsessive discussion about the Gaza war is a terrible war. People should talk about it. Nobody should let anybody get away with, critique and a serious discussion around the world about a war that is urban warfare, that is painful, that has thousands of kids have died in Gaza. People should talk about it. But there is no other war that has seen a tenth of the explosion of absolute obsessive interest. And when you come to, people in America and you say, you're talking about Gaza, but there's a much worse war, 10 times worse in Sudan, in death toll, in starvation, actual mass starvation, which in Gaza was time limited and is over. But in Sudan, it's literally happening now at a vast, and nobody says a word. What is that about? And they tell you, well, we arm you, we fund you. And I don't believe it. And the reason I don't believe it is that's exactly the same thing is happening in Holland. And they don't fund us and arm us. Exactly the same thing's happening in the streets of London. Exactly the same thing is happening in Italy. They don't fund us. They don't arm us. They're not our allies. And so, no, this is a Western explosion of a hatred of Jews, and wars that are worse happening now at this moment. More death toll, fought with Western weapons. Don't interest anybody. They're literally, and when you say it, they accuse you of whataboutism. But selective outrage isn't real outrage. Selective outrage is something else masquerading as outrage. And so the scale, by the way, and you have to also subtract from that real, actual, decent concern about Gaza, which is totally legitimate. But the scale of it, the ubiquity of it, the way it has reorganized politics in so much of the West is different, is new, takes explaining. And
it's very new, it's very scary.
Us, I think.
You mentioned 1973, and prior to 10/7, Israel had what I've learned to pronounce as the conceptia in both cases, and it was wrong. What if Israel's conceptia about the United States always being a liberal democracy open to the Jewish people from around the world to come and live and thrive as they always have in our soon to be 250th birthday year? What if that's going to change? Is Israel prepared for that, for sort of a constant eruption of anti Semitic violence, not just in Manchester, where the synagogue was attacked this past week, but all across the United States, where Jews have been under attack for 2 years?
Yes, Israel's prepared. Israel does not have such a conceptia. That's, by the way, obviously borrowing the word concept from English, but it's specifically used to mean an assumption that everyone holds to and turns out to be wrong catastrophically. That's what it has come to mean in Hebrew. I'll put it real simple. The founders of Zionism in the 19th century argued that there are these processes of nationalism and processes of collapse into populism that are going to turn all of these liberal Western countries like Germany and France at the time, they're going to turn viciously on their minorities. And first and foremost, but not only on the Jews, and the Jews have to get out or there'll be a catastrophe. That's the word Herzl used. And for the next century, history proved Herzl correct. Everywhere on earth, except in the English-speaking world, mostly in the United States, America was the exception to the Zionist expectation of collapse and catastrophe for all minorities, but also specifically for Jews. And the American Jewish experience, American Jews are the other half of the Jews. The Israelis are about 50% of Jews. American Jews are about 45% of all Jews. Those millions of Jews in America for a century spent basically just experiencing American liberalism, integration, unbelievable acceptance to the point where they actually became Americans. And I know that sounds obvious to your listeners, but no Jew in the Russian Empire for centuries was allowed to think that they're Russian. No Jew in Germany ever thought they were German for very long before the Germans explained to them that they were not. America was the first serious place where Jews became integrated to the point where they simply were the actual people. And that is a new experience in Jewish history. That's the greatest compliment any nation could ever receive in all of history, is the Jewish experience of America in the story of American Jews. So the conceptia in this particular case, Israelis have actually been surprised over the generations that America was as amazing and wonderful and beautiful as it was. The Jews could give so much to it and receive so much from it. And American Jews are the ones who stand shocked and the ones who are destabilized by what they have seen and the ideologies that have now come in from Europe, from the Muslim world, and begun to destabilize the liberal order within American society.
And that's what I'm getting at. We saw in Manchester was just the most deadly of the overtaking of the English-speaking world by anti-Semitic fanaticism. It's in the United States as well. I can't imagine it, but I'm an older guy, you're a younger guy. I can't imagine it reaching any kind of significant point in the United States, despite all the talk of Trump being an authoritarian and a dictator and all that nonsense. It's not in our bones. We're not that ideological a people, but you've got to be worried about it, don't you, given the trend in Britain and given demographics?
I don't want to, look, talking to you, Hugh, it feels a little chutzpahdik, as we say in Yiddish, to talk to you about America. But let me try and suggest a Jew's eye view of this, if that's worth anything. America is turning. There is in America a sense of real, profound social crisis. The CDC has mapped this terrible loneliness crisis. Kids are radicalizing online in insane and genuinely weird ways, which is something we learned after the Charlie Kirk murder. I mean, people were following this for a long time, but it really kind of drove it home to everybody. And there's a lot of sense of instability. And we're finding basically a kind of anti-Semitism rising on the right that takes explaining. In other words, Tucker Carlson bringing on a historian who wants you to know that Hitler really was misunderstood. And then it turns out also puts out tweets that say that Jews never accepted Christ because they hate humanity. and just this constant spewing of conspiracy, of insane conspiracy theories about Jews.
Candace
Like
Owens
Candace
being Exhibit 1,
Owens,
right?
right? But these people have millions and millions of viewers, and Ian Carroll going on Joe Rogan, and everybody's just thinking this is normal. That talk about Jewish space lasers is something that is not unreasonable. I mean, everybody laughed, but not everybody laughed. A lot of people nodded. And what is it? And I want to suggest to you that there is in America a Christian tradition, the Great Awakening. People should just look up type Great Awakening into ChatGPT. Okay, I don't know if Google works anymore. Type it into ChatGPT, and you will learn about these Christian restorationists, this beautiful Protestantism that would pitch tents all through the colonies in the 1730s and 40s, and preach a kind of individualistic, freedom-loving Christianity. In the tent would be wealthy white people and literally slaves in the tent together as equals in this Great Awakening, kind of Jonathan Edwards, if people remember from high school. It was this movement that, because America had what Washington called the tyranny of distance, it was just enormous and hard to actually traverse. But these evangelists almost traversed it. And they traveled the colonies and almost created a shared religious conversation that created a shared American identity out of these very disparate kinds of colonies, disparate cultures. And George Washington, when he's already the first president, he grew up in that Christian world. And it's a world of liberation, and it's a world of individualism, and it's a world of freedom, and it's a world that you can't understand the revolution and America without it. What the Tucker Carlsons are doing now, in this moment of crisis and sense of civilizational and social rot and decline and real danger, I mean, really, like, people are not happy. Americans are not happy people anymore. That's what the data tells us. They're actually suffering from this social collapse. And the answer that a lot of people like Candace Owens and like Tucker Carlson are offering is not modeled on the Great Awakening. It's modeled on the Muslim Brotherhood. It's modeled on a similar process happening in the 19th and early 20th centuries in the Muslim world, where they looked around, they saw their weakness, they saw a kind of civilizational decline. It was a religious crisis because Islam should be on top, it should be conquering, it should be powerful. But the British Empire had just taken over Egypt very easily, and the Ottoman Empire was being dismantled by the European powers. And the response was this religious kind of return to a restorationism, this old piety, this old, if we were like the early generations of Islam, pious and originalist, and Islam will give us all the answers, and we turn to Islam for everything. That Muslim Brotherhood organization, founded in the 20s in Egypt, that had that view, that we go back to this to this early Islam, and that early Islamic piety has everything, produced the Muslim Brotherhood, which produced Hamas as its chapter in Gaza in 1987. It also, Sayyid Qutb is one of the great heroes of that movement, writers of that movement, who produced Al-Qaeda from his writings. It produced violence. It produced brutality. It was a restorationism that blamed everybody else, that blamed a weakening of Islamic belief for creating this husk, this shell into which foreign empires, foreign ideas, foreign ideologies could step in. And by the way, the greatest enemy number one in the Muslim Brotherhood's world, is the Jews. And what Tucker Carlson argues about, he had this interview recently in which he said, the great churches of America are a hollowed out husk, and the woke walked into this hollowed out husk and inhabited it like raccoons. And who is the great enemy driving the civilizational decline? Who do they pretend invented porn? Who do they, to destroy young people, to destroy sexual ethics? Who do they claim it created mass immigration? The Jews. And so they are creating exactly the playbook of 100 years ago in Egypt of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they're taking a Christianity that they're trying to drive this kind of return to Christianity, but it's not the old American version. It's this new violent, brutal version that has enemies, that's going to go out there and do violence. And I suggest
that has no chance of working because I got to say a word in defense of Tucker, who I've known forever. I've tried to keep up on what has offended people, and I don't quite know what Tucker believes. I don't believe he's a Candace Owen, and I think he platforms people that I would never platform. But I don't think he is a Katub in waiting to spring upon the country. And I know that Charlie was very pro-Israel, and that almost everyone in the conservative movement is very pro-Israel. I worry actually about the Islamist effect throughout the United States within not off the track Christians, but on track Wahhabists. I've recommended the book The Looming Tower as many times as I have said my own name on this show because it does explain Ketub and Under the Banyan Tree and all the other milestones, all the books that he wrote. And I want people to be aware. We don't want that in the United States. But I then heard, for the first time, I heard Dan Senor make a mistake this week. I don't know if you listened to him talk to Sam Harris. Sam Harris is Jewish. He's a militant atheist, kind of a dime store Christopher Hitchens. And he began to blast religious revivalism as a danger to America. It's actually not. It's as rigorous as it was when Francis Asbury was writing the circuit for the Methodists, or John Carroll was setting up the Catholic Church to grow in its early iterations in the post-revolutionary America. I don't worry about that kind of anti-Semitism. I worry about the genuine article, the real deal Islamist extremists. I've been reading Jake Tapper's new book, Race Against Terror. That pipeline is still open. Do you know that? Do you realize it's still open to the United States? There are still Islamists coming here.
I want to say this
Are
very
you with
clearly.
me?
Yeah. So I am a big fan of religious revivalism, but it has to be the American version. Because,
Right.
I don't know, just to go back to Tucker, I apologize, I don't know the man, you do. He is fawns over the Qataris. And he loves their social conservatism, was how someone explained it to me who knows him. But the Emiratis are more socially conservative than the Qataris. What the Emiratis aren't is Muslim Brotherhood. They don't believe that the religion of Islam was hollowed out and now has to be refilled, and there's a vanguard, and we have to now rebuild our society based on that, and we have to conquer the world with it, and the Jews are the problem. And they don't fund Hamas. So a lot of this pipeline is the Qataris who he platforms, and the platforming of Daryl Cooper, and who talks about Nazis constantly. And the platforming of all these, and now on the left, this stuff is deep, and it's this anti-colonial stuff you saw in the Algeria War, and the Jews
Yes.
is front and center as well. I don't mean to let anybody off the hook. The left is doing this more actionably, but I'm telling you, when people become obsessed with Jews, okay, Jews did not invent the porn industry. All right, the top 10 names.
I hadn't
in the
heard that
founding
one,
of
by the way,
American-
Haviv.
Oh,
That was news to
yes.
me. I hadn't heard that one. I don't travel in the right circles.
It's all
obviously.
over. No, it's all over the kinds of forums that Daryl Cooper travels in. And what they talk about over there is that it's a Jewish invention to corrupt the youth, which is 100 years ago in Egypt exactly how they talked. And by the way, the top 10 names are Christians, and I think 2 or 3 of them are Muslims, and they're just business people. They're not their Christianity and Islam has nothing to do with it. They're just business people building that stuff out. But all of this stuff that it's now in the mainstream. It's now, why does Candace have listeners? And if we can't explain who is doing that and what they're thinking, what's going through their heads, I learned from the Charlie Kirk assassination that there's a universe I can't imagine, and it's out there. And
You and me both.
It's outside of
John
my
Podhoretz said
algorithm,
on the
so-
commentary podcast that the internet has allowed communities to come together that ought never to have been allowed to come together, and that ranges from pedophilia to anti-Israel or anti-Semitic cranks of all sort. I'm going back to my original question, though. Is Israel prepared to lose England and then slowly watch the United States become paralyzed over Israel and cut off arms? Because the Democratic Party, and I want to go right at this, and I apologize for putting you in the position, you're always nonpartisan. The Democratic Party has nominated an anti-Semite communist to run New York. Their anti-Semitic, hard-left, neo-Marxist wing is dominant and ascendant in their party. That means one of the 2 great parties. We've got some problems in the Republican Party. I'm not blind to them, but the Democratic Party has become anti-Israel. Are you watching that?
Yeah, I am. You asked me a simple question. Let me try and answer it simply and bluntly. Is Israel prepared to lose Britain and or America? I'll put it real simple. Yes, obviously. What are we going to do? Fall down and die? Like, what are we going to? It's not up to us to lose it, whether or not America chooses a different path. But it's a funny thing. The American-Israeli Defense Alliance. By the way, Israel won its most dangerous and existential wars. 48, America, it was under an American arms embargo. 56, 67, it won without America. Okay, America comes in the early 70s, in the late 60s and early 70s. America begins tentatively the alliance with Israel, not because of love and passionate support for Israel. America begins to support Israel. Kennedy, I think, is the first one to sign a deal to send some missiles because he's trying to keep Israel from going to the Soviet side. The Soviets have backed the
Exactly.
Arabs. He's trying to have
Yeah.
that base. And also because Israel's getting nukes and he wants, allegedly, according to foreign source, I don't have any of the intelligence, so I'm just going to talk about what I think I know. But he wants to keep the Israelis feeling safe so they don't go crazy and do something stupid. And that's the American bear hug. And that's the strategy from day one. Donald Trump just gave a defense alliance to the Qataris where he committed the United States with an executive order, I think 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, to physically stop, kinetically, militarily. CENTCOM is going to stop an Israeli airstrike on Qatar. Now, that it's a kind of good cop, bad cop, because he then protects Qatar from a crazy Israel that could do anything, this wounded tiger strategy of Israel. Qatar is now pressuring Hamas to sign the deal. It's this good cop, bad cop routine, this bear hug where America reins Israel in, that's been the actual strategy from day one. The Pentagon loves Israel for reasons having nothing to do with AIPAC or the Jews. I mean, AIPAC tries to advance this stuff, but that's not the reason. The Pentagon loves Israel because it's extremely hard to get the American defense industry to actually build new things because of vast bureaucracy and massive centralization that has destroyed competition. And Israel is a kind of workaround. You hand Israel $100 million, they'll build you an Iron Dome that America co-owns. Everything the Pentagon ever pays Israel to do, it co-owns with the Israelis. And so Israel's useful to America. That's where the relationship comes from. I don't understand the Dave Smiths who are convinced that there's this Israel is like this it can't run the information war and the Gaza war at all of any kind, but it's this nefarious capability of just controlling the minds of Americans, and every American before Dave Smith was born was an idiot. I don't understand that argument. Israel was
Well,
useful to
ignorance
America.
is a choice, and he has made that choice. Yeah, ignorance is a choice.
Yeah.
Dave Smith and many others have made that choice. They don't want to learn history because it's going to demonetize their platform. A lot of this has got to do with monetization of gathering in the 1% on the right that wants to be seduced by anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist reaction. I'm more focused on this anniversary of something I thought I could never see, the equivalent of 60,000 people invading the United States and murdering the equivalent of 40,000 Americans. I could never have imagined that. Couldn't have imagined a war that the equivalent, I think 913 Israeli Defense Forces have died in Gaza since the war began. Multiply that by 35 and you'll get the number. We can't afford that kind of a war because we can't stomach it anymore. But what Israel does, if the Democratic Party takes over and puts the squeeze on, they've got to become, as I know Netanyahu was criticized for saying little Sparta. I think he was saying self-sufficient, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was specifically at that moment. It was a stupid comment. It actually caused a massive, crash in the stock market for a few days. Prime Minister shouldn't talk that way, as if they're just talking to the mirror. But what he was actually saying was, yes, he was saying self-sufficient. And by the way, Sparta was a horrible place to be, and it existed on massive slavery, and it killed its own children. So nobody should ever be a Sparta, and don't be a Sparta. But what he was talking about was the capacity to defend yourself. And by the way, I just have to say, I'll say even more than that. If we lose America, then we will be weakened, no question. And then our enemies will try to destroy us more and faster and more often. And then we will have to fight more desperately. And our enemies will discover, and you can just look up our firepower. It's online, Jane's Defense. We'll discover that, in fact, we haven't used a fraction of our actual capability. And a desperate version of us is a version of us our enemies cannot possibly withstand or want to deal with in this world. And so,
well, I'm hoping
yes,
that by that
we
point,
will survive.
Yeah, I'm hoping by that point, some of the Gulf countries and some of your other neighbors have decided it's much better to be a friend with Israel in the protecting of our region than an enemy of Israel that turns inward while the Chinese come and pick off everything worth having in our region, including our natural resources. So, part two, I've talked about the American problem, and you've answered it. It doesn't. Israel will survive as Israel because it's strong enough, and anyone who doubts it will find out. Way out there, over 25 years, the 25 years I've lived after 9/11, do you see the Israeli political scene remaining static or shifting significantly to the right? Like Dr. Orrin, who's my age, said, look, every time, every election, we move further to the right. Do you think that is going to be the case? It's
I'm
radio.
sorry,
We
I
have
lost
to
you there
talk.
for a second.
Okay,
I'm
I
sorry,
was
I
saying,
lost
Dr.
you there.
Orrin. Okay, Dr. Orrin has said for years, Israel moves to the right with every election, with the demographic change, and especially after 10/7. The United States, I thought, was inevitably going to move to the right after 9/11, and it didn't. It actually lurched to the left with President Obama, then lurched into incoherence since then with President Biden's infirmity. What happens when Netanyahu stands astride Israel until he gets toppled eventually by age or an election? What happens after that?
There's a poll yesterday by Hebrew University, by this study center at Hebrew University, a very significant and very trustworthy poll. And one of the many, many questions it asked, it's annual, so we can track it over time, is do you trust the political leadership? Not narrowly Netanyahu, but larger, the political class, the political. And distrust of the political leadership is almost ubiquitous. I mean, only 1/3 of coalition voters, the voters for this government, for these parties, for the conservative parties, said they trust that they are. The specific question was that they are managing the country on making substantive decisions rather than only political decisions about the war, about many things. Overall, the country, 60% think that all the decisions made by the cabinet are political. Only 15% say they're substantive, and even among the coalition's own voters, only a third say that they're substantive. So there's a huge, deep, deep distrust of the Israeli political class. And when Israelis are asked, "Are you optimistic for the future of Israel?" then on almost every ground they're optimistic. On politics, they're deeply pessimistic. And so this question of what happens after Israeli politics, after Netanyahu, where do Israeli politics go? We have seen over the last 2 years that our politicians have just not been the kind of everybody in this country has rallied. Everybody. I mean, Hamas on October 7 killed 50 Bedouin Israelis, Muslim Bedouin Israelis. Muslim Bedouins went to this war with the Jews. The Druze went to this war with the Jews, and Israel then defended the Druze of Syria also, because there's this 75-year alliance between the Jews and the Druze in this region. There's a sense of solidarity, a sense of strength, a sense of competence, except when all Israelis turn to politics, and then everything feels like it's falling apart. And so, 25 years from now, what's going to be in Israeli politics? Look, it's going to be a new generation. This generation, one of the searing traumas of this moment is a leadership that refused to step up and be the leadership we needed. We've talked about this. I know a lot of people who listen to you love Netanyahu, respect Netanyahu. There's a lot to respect there. Tremendous decisions, and I've supported him on many, many of his political fights and specific decisions over the last 2 years. But he would go for months at a time without speaking to the world, but also without speaking to Israelis about his decisions in the war that their families were suffering from. And there's been a sense that they're not with us. And because they're not with us, we've been more alone, more stranded, more adrift than we should have been in this terrible, terrible emergency. Now, you could love Netanyahu and think his fundamental war decisions were right. He still caused that deep distrust and that deep sense of pessimism with the leadership of this particular government and how it has led the country. The fight over the ultra-Orthodox draft, people doing 200 days in the reserves, their businesses collapsed. And the ultra-Orthodox parties are defending, and the Likud party is defending the ultra-Orthodox, refusing to do their part and shoulder their part of the burden after everyone else is dying to protect them. So
that's on my list to ask you. I've got to say that in the United States, from our trauma of 9/11, I expected and for many years thought that the warriors of that generation who went off to fight in Afghanistan and Iraq would eventually come back and lead in American politics. And there are many examples of that, from Senator Cotton to Dan Harrigan. Cotton's been in the business for 14 years. Harrigan's been in it for 2. There are a lot of those, but not nearly enough. But in Israel, everybody serves. So I'm wondering if that isn't, in fact, going to move you significantly towards seriousness. I'm not going to say right or left, just sobriety about the world, realism. Has Israeli media changed in the 2 years since 10/7?
Yeah, I think so. But just to finish that, 1 in 20 Israelis literally went to war. So it's a whole different scale.
Right.
Afghanistan is very far away, and in sheer demographic terms, the military is not that big. In Israel, it's yes, there's a whole generation coming out of this war that feels like
That
Israel has all the strengths it needs except for that leadership, and they're a new generation of leadership that will be there. It's much more like World War II coming back and building a new America because of that
you're right.
experience.
But there's
I
no
think, but
no Eisenhower. Has IDF's training changed, by the way? Are they thinking about taking the 2 year commitment to 3 years and moving away from a reservist system, by the way?
they've already increased it beyond. I think it was 2 years, 8 months for combat men in the infantry. I don't know all the details of all the different branches, but they've already increased that. I think by 4 months, and you already have to sign that they can call you for another year without letting you go. So potentially almost 4 years if they need to, if there's an emergency. So they've already reorganized to have young people in longer if they need to. Yes.
And
And
will the ultra
yeah.
orthodox be drafted? Because from afar, it's not possible to actually stand alone in a region. Maybe with allies, maybe it'll take time for them to become allies. But you can't stand alone with a region with that many of your men not participating in national service. It'll divide the country so deeply. Even an American who has no knowledge, I've only been there twice, can see that. Right? That can't work.
Yeah, let me say so. Two things. One, the ultra Orthodox community feels more Israeli, more solidarity, more connected to the Zionist project, you can call it, even though the word Zionist in ultra Orthodox discourse specifically means a kind of opposite to religion, because it's 100 years ago was a very secular, often majority socialist, Marxist kind of a concept. So there's this a lot of history dividing the ultra Orthodox from Israeli society writ large, but ultra Orthodox society has just integrated so deeply into Israel, feels so Israeli. They speak Hebrew in the street, and their slang is Hebrew, Israeli Hebrew slang. They don't speak Yiddish anymore outside of tiny, tiny pockets. And they also have built out. One of the things we saw after October 7 was their mobilization. The Orthodox community in Israel has built out the largest medical charities in Israel. Enormous
Huh.
medical charities, rescue services, people who just there's an organization called Yad Sarah that offers free. They rent out, but for free. They loan out medical devices, whether it's wheelchairs or dialysis machines, anything that you need that you can't afford, that for some reason the health insurance won't cover properly. They'll give you for free, and you give it back to them when you have a chance. That is an enormous. They have offices in every city in Israel, and that is entirely ultra orthodox. And there's dozens such charities, and they ramped up since October 7, and they were there helping soldiers and feeding soldiers on the Gaza border, and every possible thing they did. They have a real religious problem with service, but there are all these other ways to increase their national service. For example, the Army has an enormous medical corps. There's no reason they can't take over half the medical corps as civilians in a civilian service that is adjacent to the medical corps. There are all kinds of solutions if we're looking for solutions.
Okay.
They
Well, that's good to
themselves
know.
want to do more, and I think that that'll happen. By the way, 5% of them do serve, and they didn't used
Okay.
to,
I've
so it's
got I've got
already
10 minutes.
starting.
So I got to ask you two more questions. Um, I
Okay.
do not know how Judea and Samaria can become a second Palestinian state. Maybe that's out there. But in the meantime, do you see annexation plus dominion status for what is annexed as being the next 25 years? I'm talking about a quarter century. There's not going to be an Arab state. I don't care how many people stand up in the UN and declare there's a Palestinian state. There isn't going to be one. But what is going to be there? Is it going to be dominion status like Puerto Rico is to America? That's what David Friedman, former American ambassador to Israel, has suggested. Or is it just going to be we'll just see it day by day and see what happens?
Well, I don't know what will be, but I can tell you that we have fascinating polling on this. Okay, if you tell Israelis should there be a Palestinian state, huge numbers. I don't know, sometimes it's 70, sometimes it's 85. It depends who you ask, how you ask the question, when you ask it, what's in the news that day. Will say absolutely not. And then you say, well, what if it's safe? And then suddenly you get 50% or even 55 or 60 saying, yeah, if it's safe, fine. And then you say, will it ever be safe? And then you get, 90% saying no. And so the Israeli voter, the ordinary Israeli, not, ideologues and politicians and scholars and pundits and people like me, but just the ordinary guy on the street, the opposition to Palestinian statehood is very, very pragmatic. It is not fundamental and ideological. And the poll yesterday, for example, when it said if the Arab demand, this is actually the demand of the Arab world, if the Arabs demand for normalization with the Arab world, peace and normalization in the Middle East, demand a Palestinian state, and that Palestinian state is overseen by the Arab world. So it's not just handing Hamas the West Bank or something like that. If that is an option, would you take it? And that has more than 50% agreement. Now, 80% will say absolutely no Palestinian state. And then when you come to them and you say to them, okay, but it's normalization and peace with the entire Arab world, the ideology that drives this never-ending desire to commit genocide against you is going to die. And then would you agree to a Palestinian state as the condition that the Arabs need to do that? Then you have more than half of Israelis saying yes. So I don't know what's going to happen. But I know that Israeli public opinion isn't the problem. Hamas bombing every peace treaty is the problem.
That is. All right, last question, Haviv, and I very much appreciate, especially on the anniversary of 10/7, you're taking almost an hour with me. You're not going Roman. You're not going to make a desert and call it peace in Gaza. But I imagine you're going to take over a lot of northern Gaza for a no man's zone, a no man's, no one goes there, no one builds there. Don't even think about putting a tunnel under there. We're going to patrol it, and there's not. And I imagine that will be along the long border as well, that there will be a no-person zone going there, and perhaps other places as well. But it was only 18 years after 1918 that Hitler marched into the Rhineland. How long until Israelis forget the fence being cut in, 30 different places and 6,000 people coming through?
One of the most fundamental points of Israeli military thinking and strategy, not even that, culture, just basic culture, was when I joined the basic training, when I joined the Nachal Infantry Brigade as a trainee in basic training, the biggest building on base, we all lived in tents in the desert, but the biggest building on base had on its top in huge letters the words Zrizut Gmishut Chatira Lamaga. Speed, flexibility, and striving for contact. You always try to be fast, you always try to be flexible, you always try to strive for contact. Junior officers are taught they have to solve the problem if they lose contact with headquarters. Everybody does the orders that they receive, but everybody has to be able to function on the ground and make the calls that they need to make. And you always trust the soldiers on the ground. Now, one of the reasons there were only 400 soldiers on October 7 across that entire frontier was that the generals had already built out this incredibly expensive and fancy and complex and sophisticated and high-tech fence. And the generals trusted their intelligence and they trusted their own judgment of what Hamas was thinking. And so you don't need soldiers, grunts, ordinary people on the ground anymore. That culture that we have moved away from would have saved us on October 7. In 73, by the way, that's what saved us. There were commanders on the Golan Heights who just stuck it out and fought in some of the most brilliant battles in that war and saved northern Israel in the first day of that war because they fought themselves without the high command back in Tel Aviv having the faintest idea what they were doing or what was happening. And so there will be thousands of soldiers on that frontier for all time. Our old culture would have saved us in that moment, and the new culture failed us. And that's the lesson. And so we go back, we fall back on fundamental things, and we're going to be okay. That's my belief.
Very last question. I see a binary world developing, China and the United States. Our ally is Israel. We have some other allies like Japan and Australia that we can count on. A lot of the West is corroded from within and is falling apart, but it's still there. Where is Israel going on China? Do you view that as a threat in the same way that I do for the United States, or do you view that as something so far away it doesn't matter to you?
David Ben-Gurion became pro-American when America was still placing an arms embargo on Israel. The Soviets armed the Israelis in 48 through the Czechs, but he was pro-American. He was a deep socialist who believed in the Marxist, future. but he was pro-American. The Israelis look at the American world order and they say that is the world that we need to live in, that we want to live in, that is better for humanity, that is the finest, happiest, safest, most prosperous world that humanity has ever known. And everything else has always been worse, and everything that replaces it will be worse. And so the Israelis will be pro-American no matter what happens to the relationship between Israel and America. America leads a democratic order in which there are no wars. There are wars between democracies and non-democracies, but there are no wars between the democracies. And America leads alliances and a financial global system. And there's so many problems with globalization, with displacement of working classes, and that have to be solved. But you know what? Only democracies are going to solve them. Global climate change is not going to be solved by telling the Chinese worker to stop developing and stop becoming rich and stop giving their kids a better future. It's not going to be solved by not developing the third world or the second world, or right. It's going to be solved by technology. It's going to be solved by making energy cheap and making energy so advanced that in fact it doesn't hurt the world. All the good that will ever come to the future of humanity will come from the democracies. And so Israel will never be on China's side. Will it do some deal with China to make some money or develop some defense system because America's abandoned it and it has to face Iran alone? Maybe. But at a vast, grand, strategic, historic level, even when America was literally stepping on Israel, preventing Israel from winning, helping its enemies, siding with its enemies, and literally when Israel's a third world economy, desperate to survive invading armies, it still sided, and America was against it. It still sided with America. So no, Israel's never leaving. I think in that sense, the American side of the great divide.
That is a great place to end. Haviv, I hope there is some joy in the holidays ahead, even though it's a very sad anniversary today, and I greatly appreciate your taking the time. I recommend to everyone, ask Haviv anything. It is his podcast that he does by himself. He appears as well on the Free Press occasionally and writes for the Free Press, and you can follow him and support him at Patreon, which I really encourage you to do. And if you're thinking about bringing a speaker to the States, that's the guy, Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Hugh.